This episode, I'm joined by Dan Lowe, who is a therapist working in the Reichian tradition. We discuss the work of Wilhelm Reich alongside discussions on characterology, Reich's book, The Murder of Christ, love, and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, as it runs off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Dan Lowe, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
You're welcome.
We are going to be discussing the work of Wilhelm Reich. And we've sort of been messaging back and forth since the release of my interview with James Strick, and been talking about Reich, talking about his work, obviously from the position of the fact that he's overlooked and still considered this extremely controversial figure. And we were talking about the fact that even within his own work, people would know of the mass psychology of fascism. They then might know about the function of the orgasm. And beyond that, you're really getting into the waters of like people who are sort of Reichians themselves and like true believers, you could say. And at the end of this sort of trajectory of Reichian work, I would say the two books that I found now the most fascinating, but are really like, you were not going to get to them unless you're seriously interested. So we have The Murder of Christ, and we also have Ether, God, and Devil, Cosmic Superimposition. And, you know, people will be thinking, well, what in the world's going on with those titles? And yes, it is true that Wilhelm Reich wrote a book about, almost like his theological book about Christianity and the figure of Christ. But before we get into all this sort of fairly niche Reichian stuff, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why does Reich interest you so much?
Okay. Well, I'm a former teacher. Stopped teaching, been teaching part-time up until relatively recently. And I took media and film to 16 to 19-year-olds. Really, I always wanted to be a psychotherapist of some sort. I've wanted to do that since I was 18 or 19. Fascinated by the mind. And I always saw teaching as a kind of to have a stable career while I trained, and, you know, life being life, you know, you sort of get into something and life just waylays you. And it took me a long time before I got around to training. And it took me, longer even to extricate myself from the profession, which has become horrible in this country, by the way. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. But the real thing that made, and I first got interested in Reich in the 90s, when I was at university. No, actually, prior to university, I read a book. I read Cosmic Trigger 2, I think, with infamous Robert Anton Wilson, and he mentioned Reich and his experiences in therapy. And the bit that grabbed my attention was mass psychology of fascism. And I was like, because I was always interested in politics, but it always seemed somehow really superficial and somehow not deep enough. And I was with this guy writing about the emotional roots of politics. That sounds interesting. Then I went off to university, and in my third year, there was a guy called Neil Turnbull who was fantastic, one of the lecturers, and he did a very odd unit. I can't remember if we read Reich as part of this unit or not, but he did this really fantastic unit called The Machine Society, which was just loads of weird theory, basically. It was an excuse for Neil to get out the weird theory. And we, as part of that, read Mass Psychology of Fascism. And I wrote my dissertation on, I think it was called Wilhelm Reich, A Case for Reappraisal. And it was largely a rip-off of Myron Sharif's biography. It wasn't particularly great. I didn't break any wonderful new theoretical ground, but it was kind of trying to assess what in Reich was interesting and worthwhile. And through that, I interviewed a couple of Reichian therapists, one of whom was Peter Jones, who's become a friend since then. And Peter, why Peter's fascinating to talk to is because he can connect Reich's work with very real-world things. He was a therapist. He ended up working with babies, therapy on babies, and he ended up and he ended up working as a midwife. So seeing how some of the ideas of expansion and contraction and Reich's work actually worked around the birth process, which is pretty incredible, really. I think Peter should be knighted, really, but he remains an obscure figure when he complains a lot about people not being interested in his work. So that was that was my first kind of foray of contract, and I gradually read more Reich over the years, interested in lots of other stuff, etc., etc. But the thing that really made a difference was around, I think, about 2013. Peter told me about a therapist in London called Deirdre Goff. And I decided on impulse, I felt flushed enough to go and see her. And she turned out to be a genuine kind of Reichian. And I found working with her, I worked with her for 4.5 years, and I found it absolutely transformative. It was one of I've tried lots of different disciplines and practices, and this was doing Reichian therapy every week was one of the ones that did what it says on the tin. It actually did initiate change, and quite a significant change in my relationship with women. Probably, I've got a daughter who's now 6. Probably wouldn't have her unless I'd done therapy. And I decided partway through that to change career, and I was never really happy teaching. And so coming back to being a psychotherapist, and that's that kind of takes me to where we are now, which is I retrained. I went to Roehampton to do an MA in what's called integrative counselling and psychotherapy, integrative relational counselling and psychotherapy, and that was really great because. I went in 2017, and it was great because it broadened my understanding of counselling and therapy a lot. And I've been in voluntary practice around here, and I'm now in private practice. And I've seen a lot of clients who are not interested in Reich, or not interested in Reichian, or not interested in bodywork or psychotherapy. And I think it's given me a great deal of breadth as a counsellor, and I've had lots of wonderful interactions with people on the back of that, and I've stopped seeing everything through a Reichian lens. So I've got a little bit of breadth there as well. And I'm now in private practice, and the thing that I'm kind of heading towards is starting to work in a more Reichian way, which I don't with everybody, with some people, but not with everyone. And one of the reasons that's difficult to do is literally finding the correct spaces. Most people assume that therapy is going to be a verbal thing, and finding somewhere with a space for someone to lie down, that's difficult.
And
finding somewhere with a space for someone to make noise, that's difficult. I'm still not succeeded there. But when I go to see my own therapist, I've started seeing her again, but relatively recently. I had to stop seeing her when I was doing my degree because she wasn't BACP approved, and I had to work with approved BACP therapists, which was useful, but it wasn't the same. With her, not every session at all, not even every other session, I might end up screaming, shouting, banging around. And that can be really, really useful. But if you tell your average therapist or counsellor that, they're going to look at you with wide eyes, put it that way. I'm still trying to find a space that'll allow me to do that. It's a shame. There's a great space very near me called the Open Centre on Old Street, which was a bodywork centre, but may appear to be out of business since the pandemic. But that was ideal. But yeah, I'm still looking for a space like that.
I think this is one of the fascinating things about Reich and the Reichian work, just from my own. I mean, I've started practicing it from the books of Dev Reich, the bioenergetic books. And, this understanding that, as you're saying about like talk therapy, it's great, but there's always going to be the leap between the talking is conscious, so you almost have that decision of like, I could change this thing that I'm going to say and have a little bit of control. Whereas Reich, and he makes this clear in his own books, is like, look, your unconscious is going to do this whether you like it or not. So I think some of that sort of, and Jack Willis emphasizes this in his own book, Reichian Therapy, like you need courage, because it's almost like you pull the Band-Aid off and, well, you're going to change whether you like it or not. You know, do you actually want that? And there is almost like, you can't retreat to the safety of language in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting, actually. I will note this with clients. I've noticed it with someone this morning. When people are experiencing emotion intensely, they might start to talk. They might laugh. They might indulge in some kind of displacement of the emotion. So to say, actually, well, what's it like if we stay with this emotion? You know, are we using talking as an escape? Are we using a particular type of talking as a diversion or an escape? So even in the normal counselling I do, I don't think any counselling is normal, but in the relatively normal counselling I do, I'm still very informed by a kind of Reichian sensibility, and I'm looking at I'm very much informed by his ideas in character analysis, but where character itself is seen as is possibly seen as a kind of a block to therapeutic progress. I mean, should I go into talking about Reichian therapy from there? I could.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was going to ask you the Hermitix question, but we could skip over that if you want.
No, actually, the Hermitix question would be good. I could do that one.
So three thinkers living or dead into a room, and Reich's already there, and you can listen in on the conversation.
Okay. I would pick. Do you know the anarchist thinker Colin Ward?
No.
At all? No, wrote a book called wrote a book called Anarchy in Action. He was English. He edited the journal Freedom for years and years and years, which is it was bi-weekly for a while. And since the pandemic, I think we may be doing it monthly or something like that. And it's published by the Freedom Bookshop in Whitechapel, and it must be one of the longest running political newspapers in the world. It's been going for God knows how long. They actually did an issue on Reich back in the 60s when Ward was editor, and I need to go to I know there's the archive at the Bishopsgate Institute that has all the issues, and I need to go there and see the Reich issue. But why I like him, Colin Ward, was because he is a guy who is he makes anarchism seem just really, really practical and really he was an architect and urban planner, and so there's this practical tinge to all of his anarchist ideas, but it's not overly theoretical. It's just like, well, what might the options be for increasing space for people or their autonomy in the way that we design our spaces and in the way that we live. And it's a really grounded book, which you might not think from an anarchist book, but his books are really grounded. Sorry, I should have said. Probably his most famous book is one called The Child in the City, which looks at the way in which kids in cities are limited by the city space, how they adapt to that creatively, how they use it for sort of opportunities for freedom as well. And it's just like, Matt kind of would go back to Reich in a sense, that idea of the importance of the emotional life for young people and and granting them space for autonomy and for freedom. So I would pick him, definitely. One of the others I thought I would be absolutely fascinated to meet or to hear would be the filmmaker Maya Deren, who was Ukrainian. Maya wasn't her birth name. She changed it herself. Her name was Eleanor, or her first name was Eleonora. And just what an interesting person, what an interesting life. She, again, there's that sort of there's a bodily theme So it comes back to Reich. She was very interested in dance and made a lot of films about dance. And she was Catherine Dunham's assistant when Dunham went to Haiti, and she made 4 trips to Haiti and wrote what for years was the book about Haitian voodoo, a book called Divine Horseman. Mm-hmm. She's just an incredible read. It's amazing. And it makes me wonder what else she wrote, because it shows the ability, real scholarship, real deep understanding of like voodoo, indigenous traditions. And there is an amazing chapter in there called The White Darkness, which is a first-hand account of possession, which is, it's an incredible read. As well as that, she was an avant-garde filmmaker, most famously Meshes of the Afternoon. There's another film called At Land, which are just these incredible sort of surrealist visions you can find on YouTube. And she died really young. She died at 44. And just, what a life, she's absolutely incredible person. And she was drop dead gorgeous as well, which is nothing to do with wanting to meet her, but it's, a benefit. And the other person I choose, someone a bit left field. There's a Syrian activist called Raid Fez, who's a bit of a hero of mine, who was murdered in 2018. I'm really interested in the Syrian uprising, in part because 50% or more of Syria was liberated at one time, and the people there began to use mutual aid and self-regulation to just manage their own affairs. They managed to, they were functioning without a state, or they approximated their own state, which is just, it's a massively overlooked political phenomenon, I think. So I think Raid Fez would have a lot to say to Colin Ward. And he was famous he was from a city called Cafe and Nabal, and they became famous for these kind of these wonderful sort of banners that they did, to get out on social media, painted with a certain typeface and held up by a load of activists that commented on things like the Boston bombing and offered their condolences. So these kind of humorous takes on political affairs from people who are under assault. Mm-hmm. And Raid Fez famously, he was criticised when the I can't pronounce from HTS. I'm not going to try and mangle, but when they took over his area of Idlib, they threatened him because he was playing music on the air. So he went on the air and played like animal sounds and farmyard noises and things like that, and just to send them up. And what struck me about him was he met literally the most tragic situation possible with creativity and good humour. And so he's a bit of a hero of mine. And and a lot of people don't think about the Syrian revolution in terms of kind of think of Rojava, but not so much Syria itself as mutual aid, as a case for mutual aid and things like that. But it was until Putin started dropping bombs on them all. But there we are. They've been my three.
Yeah. So Anarchy in Action, Maya Deren, Syrian Uprising, and then Reich. I mean, it's a room of freedom which is embodied. I mean, people are actually doing things. And I can second that the Maya Deren book, Divine Horseman, is a masterpiece. It is incredible.
Yeah.
Do you think that before you, perhaps the reason you warmed so much to Reich is that because he, pun not intended, but quite literally embodies that form of freedom in an individual sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was initially it was for political, but then as I sort of started to look more at his work, I recognise that I'm like pretty cerebral, and to move to and like, rather than go with, I don't know, Lacan or super intellectual forms of psychoanalysis, like why not do something that works against that tendency in myself and moves back towards the body? And that's kind of the reasons for my interest, really. And it was having this experience of therapy that was just so compelling. So, so amazing. Shall I talk a little bit about the Reich's therapy and how it evolved?
Sure.
Well, Reich, he was a psychoanalyst and a Freudian. He was Freud's star pupil for a while when Freud was pretty old. But his first major sort of therapeutic contribution was like what we were saying about character. He said, well, rather than the symptom that the person's bringing to the room, maybe the symptom is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's the way that this person is in the world that we can work on, their character. And his first big I'm not sure if it's his first actually, but he's largely remembered in psychoanalytic circles for character analysis. And it's an interesting book. I find the first couple of parts of it quite hard to read because they're in psychoanalytic jargon, basically. But it gets gradually simpler because it's written at 3 different points for his career. And it becomes more comprehensible the more you move on through the book. And he said, well, what we've got to look at is people's characters rather than just the symptom. And that led him to look at, well, how is this person in the room, in their body? How do they walk across the room when they come in? What facial expressions do they make? How do they shake my hand? And this kind of teamed up with this long-standing interest in energy that he had. And he began to develop a therapeutic method that looked at how energy might be liberated in a bodily way. And he eventually came to conceive of the body as having 7 segments, if I can remember them: the ocular, oral, thoracic, diaphragmatic, abdominal, and genital, I think. And he conceived them as running at right angle, being at right angles to the spine, and the therapy would consist of working down and working through freeing each of these segments. And my own, and if you read accounts of working therapy, you might expect to work in that way, to work down the body. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because a lot of our traumas are said to be located. If they're located around the sexual parts of our body, they're going to be anchored in the hips or, the genitals or wherever. And that was actually one of the things before I did therapy. That was one of the things that I encountered him just mucking around with stuff. It might have been the energized meditation exercises. I can't remember. But I was lying, I found, I was just lying down practicing letting my hips go. And I found, oh, wow, there appears to be some fear located there on the sides of my hips. That's quite interesting. What's that? And whenever I move them in this way, I feel a sensation of fear and I want to hold my breath. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. And I found an explanation for that when I looked at Reich's work. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think, I'm not going to, perhaps shouldn't be recommending exercises, but one of the great things about Reich is you could go pick up a book such as Jack Willis's or Bioenergetics by Sandberg, and I don't know, go do a couple of the exercises and you can test it for yourself. And the one you were talking about there with the hips, there's an exercise called I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but I think the psoas release, PSOAS release, which is like a sexual release. And you'll I think many people possibly you do that and realize, wow, there is a lot of stuff that all of a sudden your legs are doing their own thing and you're thinking, okay, what's going on here? But one thing you mentioned this at the start with this with Peter Jones, who has actually emailed me since the Jim Strick interview. But the fact he was working with infants, and just last night, just as an aside, before this, I was reading. Have you read Man in the Trap Yeah. And so Man in the Trap is a book by Ellsworth Baker, who's working in the Reichian tradition, but the beginning of the book, he has this real focus on infants and babies and the 7 zones that you've just mentioned. And it's kind of one of the most terrifying things in a way I've read, because you realize in mere minutes, hours, days, the amount of damage that is done to the human being. Kind of tragically, every single practice that we would consider normal now for how babies are treated by midwives, by hospitals as soon as they've been born, is antithetical to an approach which would give them a healthy a healthy engagement with the world. It's really quite sad.
Yeah, I think it's better than it used to be. But Peter could comment on it better than me. But there are a lot of practices, taking the infant away from the mother, the use of various drugs. There's all kinds. There's a really interesting piece called "The Origin of the Human No," which is done by Reich, which is just a short piece. It's 2 pages. It's in Children of the Future, which is just about that. It's about the kind of, it's the 50s image of birth, the baby coming out and having the call and being smacked on the arse, and a practice they do in American hospitals. I don't know at what age, but circumcision and those kind of practices, and how violating they are, basically. I think it's better than it used to be, but I imagine there's an enormous amount of medicalisation as well. One of the interesting things about, I don't know if anyone started when I mentioned therapy with babies, but one of the interesting things about working with a therapy that can operate wordlessly is that you do have that kind of possibility. You can work with infants or whoever. But Peter gives some really lovely anecdotes of doing, having a baby brought to him by the mother that had been colicky and grumbling and complaining and obviously distressed for a couple of weeks. And he said he just, touching the baby very, really, really gently, and managed to move the baby's head through a couple of planes of motion, just experimenting, just really, really gently, and as you would do with an infant, obviously. And it managed to release a tension that was there. And this kid was just relaxed and had been tense for a couple of weeks and was all of a sudden beautifully relaxed. So, amazing.
What a world where a baby is already stressed and tense. It's kind of very sad.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about that is that compared to working with adults, kids are going to experience, babies are going to experience armouring as a kind of an imposition, something that's unpleasant. Whereas an adult will be identified with his. If you tell a guy, you've got a really stiff jaw, they may be, this is who I am. This is my stubbornness. This is me. Whereas a 2-month-old isn't going to have that same sort of sense of identification with the armouring.
How would you describe armouring generally?
Reich talks about them as unconscious. Well, Reich talks about armouring as unconscious muscular tension, but you can also see it as something that manifests characterologically. One of the things about him is he's got this sort of dialectical method, which is shown by the cover of his books. There's a diagram with a line coming straight up, and 2 lines splitting off it and coming back to meet each other and forming arrows. So it looks like they're opposed to each other. And his idea is that basically these are both manifestations of the life process. So they look on the surface antithetical to each other, but there's a functional unity underneath it. So a character trait and a muscular tension are actually kind of the same thing, although body and mind might be opposed to each other. I can illustrate with an example from our experience, if you like,
sure.
Which it's quite handy this happened because it's anecdote size. I've used it in a podcast interview previously. But I did some work on a retreat with an Austrian therapist called Tina Lindemann, and she worked with me for about 90 minutes, and there were people watching. It was a kind of demo session. And at one point, she got me to bite her arm. Not hard, not at all, but she basically offered me her forearm and got me just to make contact with my teeth. Really, really gentle, you know. And I don't know whether it was that particular thing that let something loose, but I remember standing up at the end of a session and thinking, oh, nothing's really happened here, you know, and people sort of filed out of the room. And I thought, hold on, my jaw feels smaller. It feels like it's shrunk. And with that arose the feeling, I don't have to defend anymore. So I felt, there's no longer the need for me to defend. But that was a psychic translation of a bodily feeling. That was me putting that in, was me translating that feeling into words. And that's, that to me is an example of that kind of duality that Reich talks about, body and mind operating in basically being the same thing. Me noticing that bodily feeling and translating it into words. It's the same thing, but it's working on two different planes, if you will.
As a Reichian therapist, when you're walking around, do you spot armoring everywhere you go now?
Just a bit, yeah. Yeah.
Is there common types which you might say that the majority of us perhaps have a common pattern?
I think the most common thing is, I would say a common thing you notice is that people's breathing is inhibited and tense, and most people hold their breath to some degree or another, which is why breath work has become a trendy thing, because it recognises if you start monkeying around with your breathing, you start to have interesting experiences. I think breath work without a conception of armouring, I'm a bit like, I don't really understand. I think it seems a very limited understanding of things, but it's not to say it's not useful. It's useful to think about people's gaze and people's eyes and the eye contact that people make and sustain and how soft they are around the eyes. And because a lot of people have got a hard gaze, a lot of people have a tense jaw, tense shoulders, inhibited breath, and just the overall sort of muscular tonus, particularly in the city, is of people hurrying and people rushing. And, that sort of low-key kind of aggression. I'd say those kind of things are easily noticeable.
Is this predominantly sexual? So we can deal with this, the typical Reichian approach. People would understand him as the sex box man, which hopefully, if people listen to the interview with James Strick, that will have been dispelled. But to what extent is this sexual, and in what way would Reich understand sexuality? Because I think that does play a key role, but just not in the way.
Reich's main point on sexuality, if I read him right, is that we are defended against it and we're afraid of it. And he would say, armouring ultimately has its root in the conflicted way that we are with sex. While I would say that appears to be true, I wouldn't say that's something you can access very easily with most people. That idea of starting with the eyes and working your way down the body. You might notice tensions with people, but it's not necessarily saying you're going to have easy access to their sexual conflicts. I don't think that's the case. I think most conflicts are pretty well guarded, and kind of hidden under the armour, so to speak. And people, you could say that maybe people develop substitute patterns of contact on the surface of them, which is kind of what you were saying with Jim in the discussion about the sexual revolution. I think, like kind of promiscuity and sleeping around loads, while it may be fun, it certainly isn't liberated sexuality in a Reichian sense, which would be about softness, gentleness, and contact, which is something you don't hear people talk about very often. But it's like, what does it mean to have warm contact with another person? And that kind of soft and gentle aspect alongside that, where's that in our discussions of sex? I can't remember the last time I read or saw a discussion of sex that incorporated that gentle emotional tone. And I think if you said to a lot of people, you're interested in incorporating emotion into sex, they would be, what? I wouldn't even understand what you were talking about. I had an interest in it. I had another I've got another therapeutic anecdote I can share if you like. Think about, but a lot of the time, this stuff is very subtle, and my own limitations as a therapist at the moment are how much I can work with body armor. I can't do what my own therapist does to me. I'm trying to learn, but I'm not as good, not as skillful as her yet. But she's 30 years ahead of me in experience, so what do I expect? But when I was working with her like 2 weeks ago, I was quite angry and frustrated when I turned up to various things, and was sort of fed up. And I found that she worked with my back and the sort of paraspinal muscles along the sides of the spine, and that kind of got my chest to kind of drop a lot. And when we were working with my arms, there was a kind of pulling going on in my arms. So and when I eventually relaxed that, my whole chest dropped, and I suddenly had access to much softer feelings, like sort of heart feelings, you might say. I was like, okay, I turned up, and I very much, I've done years of work like this, but a couple of weeks out in the world, I turn up, my chest is up like that. I'm encouraged to drop it, and all of a sudden I have access to more loving feelings. So my point is that this stuff is subtle, and the way that we defend ourselves against that stuff, even without intending to, no matter what we might assert, because that's the thing with Reich, it doesn't matter. You would say, your intellectual assertions don't matter. It's what you do with your body that's important. So in terms of accessing something that's a lot more gentle. That's a word you never really hear in discussions of sex, is gentleness. I
think a lot of our modern appreciations of sex from a Reichian's perspective would probably he'd probably understand them as sadistic.
Yeah.
Domination, it seems that's where the trends are going.
Yeah. There's a great bit in character analysis again. There's a chapter called what is it? Psychic contact and vegetative streamings, or something like that. I think it's chapter 14. It's quite theory heavy at first and a little bit hard to understand, but one of the later sections, 7 or 8, he talks about substitute, all the ways in which we have substitute contact. And it's really, really interesting, just all the ways in which that we might delude ourselves we've got something when we don't have that real felt contact. It's a really interesting read.
I mean, it's a broad question, but why do you think we are so, perhaps not scared, maybe you would say we're scared, but we're so reluctant to be embodied? Why? Where has this whole neglect of the body come from?
No, we live in a society that emphasises technology, that gets by on technology, and you need minds to to make technology. So we step away from using the hands, moving around. We step away from our kind of embodied selves. I think it's a sort of welcome trend in therapy and other types of thinking, in meditation and stuff like that, the return of embodiment. And I think it speaks to the lack that people experience of that stuff. I mean, what do you think? What's your feeling?
Control.
Yeah.
Back to the whole idea of language. People are in control with the language. And you get to the body, you don't really have a choice. If you get embodied, it will do the things it needs to do because it has intuition and an instinct and all these things, which is running all the time anyway. Heat regulation, breathing. There's a jet that somehow seems to be circling over my house, by the way, which is why the sound is coming through. But yeah, breathing, 1,001 different internal processes, unconscious processes, which we'll never we shouldn't be controlling ourselves. And so there's this sort of, I think perhaps an admittance, if you become embodied, that you aren't fully in control. And that's pretty terrifying in a world which I think puts being in control, being rational, being logical at the forefront of all decisions. But obviously any all psychoanalysis would tell you really that we're not. We don't make logical, rational decisions. We make them based on a faulty logic, but so they seem rational. Like you were saying, you always bring, we sort of clear out a space and then we quickly bring something else in to use as next excuse or whatever it might be. Yeah. But I think, I think control and it's also, I think, doing, like, just to mention another exercise, it's called the bow and the arc, like the two sort of classic grounding Reichian exercises, which people want to look them up. They're just called the bow and the arc. Reichian, I'm sure you'll find them. Yeah. But when you really get the feeling in your feet, the blood flowing through your body, the energy flowing through your body, and then you walk out into the world and you're very feet on the ground, not so much head in the clouds, it can be quite daunting if you haven't had that real grounding sense for a long time. All of a sudden, distances are very apparent. Those people are there, that table is there, and you're very completely in it, and it can be quite not necessarily overwhelming, but it's almost like, whoa, I've just been ignoring this for so long.
Yeah, well, that to me sounds very much like a child's experience of the world. When the world is, when things are big and daunting, and distance is hard, and it's much easier to retreat into your head and not think about these things. I think also the body, in a sense, we can't, with that idea of control, we can't make it do what it wants. What we want, it will get sick, it will age. There's a lot of trends in our culture which are sort of in support of denial of that. The weakened body, the body that becomes soft. That's something we don't really like thinking about.
And one of the just from the two books that we were reading in preparation, one of the big themes, and this was especially in Ether God and Devil, and Reich does this with a lot of terms throughout his whole work. So in Mass Psychology of Fascism, he talks about conservatism, but it's really not. It becomes not a political thing. It becomes the like you're wearing your Sunday best, the armoring behind little etiquette things, and these amass into a sort of anti-holistic, like it's holistic, but it's bad for you, like a negative holistic thing where you've amassed all these little conservative things which are containing you. And he does this with a lot of words, and one is guilt. Guilt for Reich, I think, just seems so important, that a lot of armoring is people holding a guilt which for Reich seems almost like people feel guilty to live.
Yeah. It's something that comes out a lot in therapy. If you get, verbal therapy or or body therapy, if you get people talking and you get people to loosen a bit, lots of people have stuff they feel bad about. Lots of people have things that they're, I don't know. I said earlier, one of the things I like about the therapeutic journey I've been on is I appreciate talking therapy now. And with things like guilt, I think being able to talk that out and express that freely is really, really beneficial. I think with Reich, in a way, I think he says in He Forgotten Devil somewhere about what the primary emotions are: pleasure, longing, anger. I can't remember all of them, but guilt's a slightly more sophisticated emotion. So it isn't or sophisticated process, not an emotion. So it isn't necessarily the first thing I think of when I think of him. And I wonder if it did make me think that the question when you asked it made me think, I wonder what the role of guilt was for him. Because it must have played a huge role in driving him. Just to sort of recount some of his biography for a second, he was brought up on a farm, and he had a tutor as his sole educator. He didn't go to school, which maybe explains some of his mental agility, I think, really. But when he was 12 or so, he caught the tutor having an affair. Caught the tutor sleeping with his mum, and he went and told his father. His father confronted the mum, beat her, huge arguments, and she eventually, I think, drank a cleaning product and killed herself. And the father was also racked with guilt after this. So he went and he committed sort of a long-term suicide by kind of going out fishing every day, kind of on a really cold lake, without wrapping himself up enough. And he got pneumonia and died as well. So you've got this kind of double family suicide around sexual trauma with a kind of Oedipal component for Reich. And Myron Sharif in his biography calls that the origin of the mission. And I think it probably was in a lot of ways. So I would say unconsciously guilt was probably a huge driver for Reich, and unacknowledged guilt as well. He didn't, back in Myron Sharif's biography, which was 82 or 84, he reveals that for the first time. He makes the connections with the paper that he had found, and I think in some of the later biographical works, that's woven in. But Reich never acknowledged that in his life. So I suspect unconscious guilt was one of the drivers for him throughout his life. I suspect.
Where does love come into all of this? Because I think love is what's Reich's quote? It's at the start of all of his books, isn't it?
Yeah, love, work, and knowledge.
Love, work, and knowledge.
Or the wellsprings of our life, they should also govern it. Yeah,
that's the one.
Yeah. Love is like fundamental to him, and I think he would regard it as the fundamental process because in that list of emotions I mentioned in He Forgotten Devil, love is the first one, and they're arranged in order of primacy, and for him, love is the first one, and love. This is in a way where Reich gets quite weird is that you have to think about, you can think about these things as kind of, rather than concepts or ideas, you can think about them as embodied movements, and even what he calls plasmatic movements. So what would it look like, the movement of love in a really, really simple form of life? It looked like a kind of reaching out to food or something like that. And this is kind of why he was into microscopy. and he started looking at amoebas and really, really simple forms of life, because he wanted to see, what do these simple forms of life, how do they move, how do they do, what do they do?
Mm-hmm.
And so Myron Sharif says again, he was trying to drive life into a corner, reduce it to its lowest terms, and he seemed to feel that, like, the process of love, or that kind of reaching out, you can analogize that someone's yearning that's felt in the chest. He felt you could analogize that to much more simpler forms of life, and you see them reach out to things in their environment, and that may be a bridge too far, or a strange bridge for most people to cross, but that's kind of fundamental to his thinking. Seeing it in reducing the emotions down to his very embodied terms, and it makes a lot of sense to me.
At the beginning of the Ellsworth Baker book, he talks about an amoeba, where if you leave an amoeba alone, sort of thing, and allow it an expansive environment, it'll reach out. It'll draw itself out, and he has illustrations about this. But if you have it and then you prick it with a pin, it'll retract and tense up. But if you only do that once, then it'll be like, okay, whatever, go back and reach out again. If you do it a few times, then it will reach out, but it will do it slowly because it's sort of hesitant. We could say anxious, fearful. If you do it enough times, it just will close up forever. Because it's terrified. I guess terrified of the world. And I guess when you take that's the simplest form of life, really, an amoeba, as a single cell organism. You then, as it gets more and more complex, that exact same pattern is just a more complex version of a human being. Keep prodding a child and slapping them over the back of the head. Eventually, they're gonna do the same thing as the amoeba.
Yeah. And that's why he was interested in microscopy and looking at these forms of life, because he felt they had something fundamental to tell us about our own life processes. Something I was going to say there. In terms of love, there's a really nice illustration I did a thread about this, talking about armour on Twitter, in Listen Little Man, where you've got this guy reaching out you've got this cartoon. The cartoons are by William Strick. No, not William Strick. William Steig. It was a cartoonist for the New Yorker, and you've got this guy with really long, extended arms, reaching out towards some flowers. Right, that illustration is meant to show this sort of yearning that's felt in the chest, and this physically expressed by reaching out towards the environment. And this sort of extending out into the environment to kind of meet it and to meet this object of beauty. With a kind of, and there'll be a softening of the chest and the arms not held back and able to reach out. And it's that kind of process that cartoon is illustrated. And there's actually a therapeutic exercise. I don't know if you've encountered it I think it's in the Reichian Therapy for Home Use book, where you're encouraged to reach for an object and to keep reaching with the arms and the hands and to kind of to reach for something. While you're lying on the therapist couch, that experience of reaching, that experience of being able to open up here and reach out for something that you want. It can be quite a powerful therapeutic exercise.
Mm-hmm. Well, one other thing, one of the book we read, The Murder of Christ. I mean, it's such an odd book. Yeah. So just to bring that in, I mean, we're moving from love. Who is Jesus Christ for Reich? Because people who know Reich only from his the stereotype of Reich would think, wait, what? Yeah. He took Jesus seriously.
Well, you see, one of the reasons why it's such a peculiar book is because Jesus is occupies about four different positions in the book. There are at least four things I can think of, but one is the historical Christ, and there's material in there that might well be out of date by now about who Christ was historically. Then there is Reich himself. Reich himself as kind of, as persecuted genius, because he had two huge conflicts in his career. One was the all the stuff that's detailed in Jim Strick's book in Oslo, and the other was the stuff that put him in jail at the end of his life from the Food and Drug Administration. And so he's got that sense of himself being a persecuted figure. A lot of the time in his books, there's a bit of an identification with Giordano Bruno and sort of Kepler and early scientists who kind of invoked the wrath of the church. Then also Christ is kind of children and babies, and kind of the way in which we might kill life in them by constricting their sexuality, teaching them to be afraid of their bodies, being overtly disciplinarian, all of that kind of stuff. So, and on a more, I suppose a more metaphysical level, there's just the idea of life itself as Christ, and kind of the forces that suppress life as crucifying Christ. So what nails Christ to the cross, and the process of being nailed to the cross is kind of like the process of the formation of armoury. So yeah, it is a very strange book, but kind of really, I think that idea of something really, really innocent and unarmoured and free, and the way in which we might restrain and constrict that is really, really interesting. Looking at the ways in which we might do that, and the ways in which our society does it, and that's the murder of Christ for Reich.
So just what I was about to ask is, is that why we kill Christ? Is because he's sort of the ultimate symbol, representation of what it is to finally release all your armor and love life.
Yeah.
And we can't stand. Why can't we stand that when other people are free?
Fear, and what I would say, our own armouring, the fear that's anchored around our breaths, around our hips, in our thighs. That kind of suppression of our own sexuality makes us so fearful when we see it freely expressed outside ourselves. I don't know if I give an example. Something I read your question about the emotional plague, which is, I think Reich uses that concept a bit too freely for me sometimes, but I just directs it at everything he doesn't like. But it basically means organised hysteria. I remember sitting with my dad once and just watching TV, and there was some footage from Jamaica of a couple of dancers who were wearing, batty riders, really tiny shorts, and were kind of gyrating, really sensuous, really, very, very sexual, sinuous kind of dancing. And my dad was like, "Oh, that's disgusting." And I remember even thinking, "Man, do you really think it's disgusting?" What I think was, he was aroused by it, and he was discomforted by his own arousal. And my presence there added another layer of discomfort as his son. So he has to say, "That's disgusting," and try and shut that down. And you could imagine that happening physically, with a tightening of the breath, tensing the thighs, squeezing the legs together, that kind of thing. I didn't notice whether he did that, but it wouldn't surprise me if something like that had happened. And the emotional plague is when, if my dad had then gone and written a letter to the BBC about that, then got together with a group of other concerned citizens and held a protest outside the BBC, then that would be Reich's emotional plague in action. It's the way in which the sensuous, when we see it, provokes our own fears and it makes us tense up against that. that's kind of, and I'm sure we can all imagine that process at work in us, and that's, I think what Reich means by the murder of Christ, by the way we must suppress these things.
Do you feel like in the modern world, well, I guess contemporary West I'm speaking of, we believe we've made a lot of headway with sexual emancipation, gender theory, how these things are treated, but it seems like it doesn't really feel like we have in any Reichian sense.
No, yeah, I would agree. It's those inner ideas about things like contact where we haven't made, and teaming that with our understandings of sex, I think are, that's where we're lacking. I mean, I do think there's some positive trends. I think the way that there's been studies of happiness, the way that aspects of masculinity are thrown into question now. If you can do that in a way that isn't just self-punishing and hating yourself for being a man, I think that's worthwhile. It's the widespread acceptance of that people do have emotional lives and the importance of things like counselling, the importance of things like therapy. That's kind of recognised as part of a discourse now as something that people might need. I think those are positives, but they're held over here, and our understanding of sex are kind of held over here, and it's a bit never between shall meet. So there's that kind of contradiction for me. But a lot of this, I don't know. I think when you understand what Reich's talking about when he talks about secondary sources of gratification, a lot of the ways in which we have made progress, so to speak, look pretty shallow. I mean, an idea would be porn, like not to be anti-porn or like moralistic about it, and regardless of the kind of misogyny that's baked into loads of porn, it's a secondary source of gratification. It's an aid to masturbation. It's not about having sex with someone. So why are we even interested in it? The complexities of a real person, building a relationship with them, that the expression of that in sex and sexuality, that's fundamentally a million times more interesting than any porn video. So I don't, the only thing I can think of that drives the interest in that is this kind of, is this kind of unsatisfied, unconscious, it's unsatisfied, unconscious sexual longings, I would say, but it's still ultimately a kind of substitute.
Are you optimistic about the future with regards to, because that seems to be getting worse, that sort of social alienation, sexuality seems to be statistically heading towards more and more people just sitting alone, watching porn.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about that future from a Reichian perspective?
I'm optimistic about some trends. Like I said, some of the incorporation of the emotional life into our understanding of the world. I mean, just things. I think like it's no longer okay to beat your kids. Yeah, that's progress. It was okay for hundreds of years, and now it's like it is now no longer cool. Things like that are progress to me. So I'm optimistic on that front. Not that optimistic when I look at our representations of sex and sexuality. No, but hopeful maybe, but not optimistic. I think the way in which we treat children has improved. Though there's tendencies to kind of treat them as statistics and over-test them, particularly in this country, which I think are totally awful, things I think are awful. But I mean, even there's so much. There seems to be so much fear around kids and letting kids be free. I'm not optimistic about that, but I think with the way that we accept that children have emotional lives now, that's progress, you know.
A mixed bag then for the future.
A mixed bag, yeah, pretty much.
Is there anything you'd like to add about Reich or Reichian therapy that you'd like to touch on?
One thing I would say is just read him and just like get the books. There are millions of them because of what happened to him, because his books got burnt. I believe Morris Strauss of Farrar, Straus and Gyro was so disgusted, he made a point of making sure that they stayed in print. A lot of the books, you may have lost a lot of the journals, but a lot of the books are in print. And I would say, if you're interested, just read that. Just read him. Do not read the secondary. Well, there's some decent secondary materials, but you know, Jim Strick's book is amazing, for instance. But actually, read the primary sources and work out what he said. And also, if you're reading it, you have to take the idea of orgone seriously. You have to read it. It might seem absurd, but you have to read it and take it as a regard it as a thought experiment. You have to take that seriously. His books don't make sense unless you do that. And that's something I would encourage people to do.
Yeah. That seems like a good place to finish up.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want me to say anything about orgone?
Yeah, we could talk about the orgone. I mean, does it play a role in your therapy? I mean, would you be, or is it something that's just is in the background, maybe as the energy that's happening, that's being released?
It's kind of in the background, but I really see the idea of expansion and contraction as at work. Like, people often come in contracted and I'll be thinking, how can I make them expand? What can I say I do to make them expand? And I'll regard that as kind of an energetic process, even if I'm not thinking explicitly about orgone. I think it's important to talk about it in Reich, because when you talk about Reich, because I had a tendency. I noticed I had a big thread about armouring and I left it out, and I thought, I'm unconsciously trying to make it more palatable. I think it's a difficult, challenging idea. So that violates people's sense of what's possible. And but it certainly seems that it is possible. You know, if you have experience with an orgone accumulator, you just go, right, okay, well, that seems to work. You know, and most people don't have that experience, so they assume Reich was a madman. But I wrote a thread. I put it up at the weekend, actually, in response to kind of have you seen the Olivia Lang book, Everybody?
Yeah, I did see your thread, and then I looked into the book, but I haven't read it. So you were saying that's like the most 2021. It's like the most recent book that's dealing with Reich, and but it's more focused on freedom.
Yeah. And like, it's not a terrible book, but the treatment of Reich is just, he's so flawed, because she assumes he's mad. So it's like, I'm not going to look at any of the science stuff. Just not interested. So she ends up with this really superficial treatment of him. Whereas if you start looking at him and you're thinking about expansion, contraction, the work with the bions and microscopy, and you have a sense of how it grew into his eventual vision, you know, it's hard to sustain that view that he was just this mad guy. You know, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, really. So, yeah. I mean, it just doesn't stand up for Fred. I'm not trying to say people should believe in orgone, but if you look at how energy was this kind of recurrent thing for years and years and years and years, he came back to in all kinds of different arena. And then if you look at how tentative he was, like all the stuff in the cancer biography about, you know what? I sat with his observations for years before I went public with them. That idea that it's a schizoid delusion is extremely hard to sustain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which is not to say he's right about everything. I don't know, I don't necessarily think he was right about everything. I don't know, but he has credit with me. You know, I will take him seriously, rather than this sort of rote dismissal, which is, boring, if nothing else.
And lazy. That's the problem.
Yeah. They're intellectually lazy, very much so. Yeah. One of the interesting things about Jim Strick's book, I think, he mentions in it, he says it will be hard for a scientist working now to actually understand Reich's biology because we're so influenced by DNA, by biologists, so influenced by DNA, and we're so influenced by the power of the electron microscope. We're not really going to understand what Reich's talking about. He's talking a different language. And why I think that book is so good is because it recreates the intellectual world of the 30s and the 40s, and you can get a sense of, right. There were all these guys working with dialectical materialism. There wasn't just one person working with the idea of vital energy. It was a whole field. You know, not the most, not a particularly massive field, but it's the history is always more complicated when you look. You know, yeah.
People don't like looking.
Yeah, I would agree.
Where would you advise people to begin with Reich?
If you want something you can finish in an afternoon, read Listen, Little Man, which is, it's a great polemical work. And a friend commented to me, it's a hectoring little book. And I thought it was really revealing. I thought you found it a hectoring little book, so you felt hectored by it. So that was quite a revealing comment from him. So yeah, if you like that and it doesn't put your nose out too much, read Function of the Orgasm, obviously. I've been blown away actually in preparation for this. I've been absolutely blown away by reading Eve of God and Devil. Again, what a book, it's quite incredible. I wouldn't say people to begin there. I really, really like the last section of character analysis. That's got there's an extended case study in there with a schizophrenic, which is really illuminating on Reich's understanding of mysticism, which is just an incredible piece of work. And Matt uses his energetic conception fully, and it's really, really hard to read that and have the idea that the energy he was talking about is an illusion. Mm-hmm. You can't sustain that position if you read that.
Okay.
It's
a good amount to start with there.
Okay, brilliant. Okay.
But yeah, I think that's a good place to finish up. So
brilliant.
Dan Lowe, thanks very much. But also I should say you also do like intellect discussions. Yeah, you're on Twitter always chatting about Reich. So I'll put those links in the description below.
Yeah. And I may try and get a Substack or something together. I think I should do something like that. Maybe me and Peter can do one. I think that'd be good.
That would be good. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.